Hi, guys.
Hello. Hello,
How's it?
friends.
Yes, hello. How's it going? If you're here, drop a hello in the chat. I'm so excited about this one. I feel like I have so much
Let's hold the book up.
The only time Meghan ever brings her book.
She brought it for this one.
It's the most important one. Manny's here.
Yay.
Hi, Manny.
Hey, Manny.
Can always count on you.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Can always count on Daniel. Can always count on Will. Hi, guys.
It's our gang. It's our gang within a gang.
Yes.
Love it. So glad you guys are all here. Did you bring something, a beverage of some sort? Like
I did not.
No seltzer water.
No, we're out. Hello.
Hello, Belladonna.
Bella.
My mom's name is Donna.
Nice.
Fun fact. Cool.
Hello.
So, if you read the book, let us know.
Yes.
If you didn't read the book, also let us know. No judgment.
Yeah, absolutely none. It's kind of like, so my favorite podcast is True Crime Obsessed. I've said this before a million times on here. But what they do is they watch documentaries, like true crime docs, and then they do it so well, like they talk about it so well that you don't have to watch it. So what we do is we talk about the book so well, you guys don't really have to read it.
We read the
but
book.
We want you to. Yeah, but we still want you to read the book. If you can.
Buy the book. It helps the author and it helps us.
It does help the author, yeah.
Cool. So yeah, let us know if you read it and if you liked it. Here we go, Daniel. The book was great. Helps inform discussions about the Black Lives Matter movement. Good timing.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess we could talk about that a little bit, because in June, we hadn't yet picked the July book. Erica.
Hi, Erica.
Oh, dear. So glad you're here. So with everything that happened in June with, the Black Lives Matter movement, we wanted something that was gonna help us like take action and make change. Because I think a lot of us right now are feeling like without, social movements happening, we're stuck at home and feeling like cabin fever. And then you have all this stuff happening in the world and you're like, I want to get out of here so I can fix something.
Yeah, but then you're like, how do I fix that thing?
What do?
What do we do?
That's what you do. You read this book.
It's a manual, you guys.
It's literally a manual.
And it's easy to read. It's very easy to read. Oh, Nell's here. Hi, Nell.
Hey, Nell. We took our notes and it's through the chapters, this is our Yang notes. We gotta
yeah. Eventually we'll have a website, you guys. Yeah.
That could be helpful if anyone hasn't read it. Maybe after this we'll share that because this is one of those ones where it's just this is information we think everyone should have. Eric is here. We were talking about how this stuff should be taught in school, in high school, debate team, and then also make something happen in the school team. How do you do that? How do you bring about change? So super, super influential read. It's been out for a few years too. So it's
yeah,
I heard that my cousin was talking about how this one, he'd heard of this one and how it was a very popular read amongst college students, especially in political science and social science.
2017. I feel personally radicalized by this book.
We've been fully radicalized. Has anyone else been?
Yeah. Hi, Steven.
Hello. Welcome.
Yeah, I think it should be read in schools. Like, because the thing is, it incites you to action, but it like really good action. And when I said radicalized, it's kind of a joke, but I just feel like the next word is indoctrinated. Can you guys tell I grew up in a room in a church? But it's really good. Anyways, I feel very like excited about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely like the fact that it's just like this information that's just like in the palm of your hand, just given to you so clearly and concisely. It like gives you hope that you're like, oh, I can actually do something about this.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's a good feeling. As opposed to just sitting around like, that sucks. We're all gonna die.
What do I do?
Don't know. No, you do know. So yeah, great. So wait, did we put up Steven's comment right here?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, but I'll put it back up so we can talk about it.
Yeah. So you study this stuff in school, a philosophy seminar on nonviolence with a professor who was a friend of Gene Sharp. That
Pretty
is
cool.
Yeah. You should be up here with us right now. The experts. We just read the book.
Yeah. But, feel free to chime in the chat.
Right. So yeah. So how does this? Did this add anything? I would just wonder, like, did this book add anything, or was this sort of like a good baseline? And maybe there's other books that we should consider reading to continue our education on the matter. So someone's here.
Hi, Mom.
Hello, Mrs. Mom. Mrs. Van Syrock. Teacher.
Yes.
Cool.
Jenna said, I like that it illustrated key points of social movement that linked each other together. A lot of stuff I learned about on a surface level. Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. We kind of like talk about this while we're going through the book, but he mentions they mention two authors. They mention a lot of different movements, but they always bring it back to like there's two that I can think of that they are constantly bringing it back to. So yeah, they do a lot of like linking of like, this is what this movement did really well, and this is what this movement did really well. This is what this movement should have done. Like,
yeah. And I think that's one thing that was so effective about how this book was written, because it was very much a layering effect where it was like very clear, like you have chapter 1 is the strategic turn, and then 2 is structure and movement, and 3 is the hybrid. And it takes these, like, it's a little bit sequential, like it does start like more so like kind of in the 60s, I think, 50s and 60s, and then brings you closer to contemporary times. So it has a slight linear thing, it goes in like one chapter is like one topic, and then the next chapter is building on that with another topic, but it's not all compartmentalized either. It's like, he talks about the civil rights movement early on, and he's talking about the civil rights movement later on. So, each chapter builds on the last one in a significant way.
Yeah. Hi, Giselle.
Hey, Giselle. So happy you're here.
For those of you guys who don't know, Giselle is the one who gave us the heads up for this book, actually. Yeah, so she recommended this, and I'm so glad that she did, because it was a really great book. Yeah. This was, like we said earlier, perfect timing, I think, for this kind of read. And yeah, so should we get started with our official discussion? Let's do it. So if anyone has like a quote that you want us to talk about, feel free to put that in the chat with the page number preferably. But we have plenty of quotes and moments that we're gonna hit before. Okay. Often that winning a UBI will require a mass movement, and this book can help
guide us. Yes.
Yes. And that's what happens. Oh, that's what happens in Crisis 2038. Another great book that you guys should read.
See our last, was it our last one?
I don't remember.
I think, the one before that.
Yes, so this is the one with Giselle, and we talked about Crisis 2038.
Yes. My favorite moments in the book was when they mentioned the civil rights movement, as I have been influenced from meeting with people who were in the front lines and worked directly with Dr. King. Yes, Manny has lots of amazing stories, I'm sure.
Yes, and pictures. He's always putting pictures up on Twitter. So if you guys don't follow Manny on Twitter, follow Manny on Twitter. He's always got great info, great stories, and great pictures.
Yes, and history tips.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's just start with the introduction. So from the introduction, we picked one quote. So I'll read it right now. So it's on page, I think we might have shared this too. We've been trying to share quotes like throughout the month as well. So if you're like not able to read the book or get a hold of the book, you can still kind of like read those quotes and then come to the meeting and participate. So we shared this one. This is on XXI 11.
21?
Yeah. Think about it for a second. So, nonviolence is usually regarded as a philosophy or moral code. Much less frequently is it studied as a method of political conflict, disruption, and escalation. This is a missed opportunity. If we are perpetually surprised by unarmed uprising, if we decline to incorporate it into our view of how societies progress, then we pass up the chance to understand a critical phenomenon and to harness its power. So, what are our thoughts on that? Meghin, what were your thoughts when you kind of first read this introduction to the concept of nonviolence?
Got me off guard there with that question.
If you want me to start.
You can go first. I gotta think about it for a second.
Well, I just think, so what he's getting at here is, I'm just gonna say he. Okay, no, say they. Say they. I'm gonna say they because it's like two
brothers, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. What
they're getting at here is the idea of it's usually regarded as a philosophy or moral code. So it's like the idea of thinking of nonviolence as not something that's just kind of like sedentary and something that you just like think on it and it's just like symbolic or something like that. So it's kind of like it's smart. It's like pragmatism. And like people always bring up that book, The Art of War. I haven't read it, but I feel like maybe it's kind of like that where like he's really trying to define nonviolence as something that is like, even though it sounds maybe passive, it's actually the opposite. It's like something that is actionable, that can lead to progression and cause change in a society.
Yeah.
So I think it was really important that they made that distinction. So we have this concept of a very clear concept of what nonviolence actually is before we go into the book.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, like the choice of words too, if we're perpetually surprised, because they're talking about how we're not incorporating it into our view of how societies progress. And what he means there is that like we're treating it like it's like an anomaly of history when we look back in history and like there are always some kind of uprisings, always some kind of movement happening, and I actually highlighted something before that. So I'll read that one too, because it kind of goes into what I was going to say. But in the paragraph before this one, it says, many of the critical advances of the last century and a half, the end of slavery, women's suffrage, the restriction of child labor and implementation of workplace safety standards, and the outlawing of many forms of discrimination owe less to the legislative endgame that formalized acceptance of these causes and much more to the social movements that put them on the map. And I think that's kind of why they get lost in history, is that we just see the end game and assume oh, it's all the legislation that got it passed. But it's like, well, who brought the topic up in the first place, right? Was these social movements, you know, these movements that people have and they get behind and they march and they protest and all these things we'll get into in the book. And we kind of like praise the legislation and we're like, oh, great, legislation got passed. And then we're surprised at the next uprising, the next movement, right? And so it's kind of lost in history.
Right, which I think maybe we should throw up Giselle's comment, because I think that we, you know, going back to, you know, the original conversation we had with Giselle when she recommended this book to us, was the thing that piqued our interest, I remember, was when she was saying, you know, the book is really talking about how, like, the media portrays these movements as if they came out of nowhere. You know, like they're like you said, this anomaly, and I'm sure like probably like Yang Gang and like the conversation around UBI and stuff seemed like it came out of completely left field. But it's really like, you know, like that's why Andrew Yang would always bring it back to. It's like, well, no, like, you know, most, like, I forget what's the percentage of people who 40% or something of Americans can't afford an unexpected $400 or $500 expense. You know, it's like this is, you know, like, and then what led us to getting here, you know, and he would tell that story. So, and it kind of, it's interesting, it kind of gets into a topic of like storytelling and how important that is. Like, kind of a random side note, but I remember one of the like few history, you know, I was never that good at history because it was so much like, remember these dates, you know? And so the things I remember from my history lessons is when I had history teachers who were good storytellers and like would explain the historical context and the characters that were involved, you know, the historical characters that were involved in leading to change happening. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff just in the introduction.
Yeah, it's really good. And a lot of this stuff we're going to talk about later, like the media and like how the media portrays things. That's, I think they have almost kind of a whole chapter, like kind of on that. You know, so it's so good, you guys. Like, I feel like I'm just going to keep saying that. Like, this book is so good.
Boston cream donut. I'll drink my smoothie. Here we go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Will. 40% can't afford a $400. 40%! 40%! We're the richest country in the world. Like, oh God.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I'm back. Okay. So anyone else have some comments? I'll throw Giselle's back on here. Yeah, harness it and feed it into, so let's maybe just get into how do you harness it. So for me, like chapter 3 is like one of my favorite chapters, but I think when I went back and like reviewed for this discussion, I really see how like chapter 1, 2, 3 are like almost like a little section of their own. So I think it's good that we lay it out and, you know, go through the progression that the writers intended. So, so chapter 1 is called The Strategic Turn. So it's really like getting this is like chapters getting at kind of gets into some history and kind of like some basic fundamental ideas, foundational ideas. So maybe I'll share, we have 2 quotes. I'll share the first one and you want to share the second one?
I see 3 on our page.
Oh, no, the middle thing is just the terms.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Sounds good.
So, first one, this is on page 6 if you have the book. Whereas violent rebellions play to the strengths of dictatorships, which are deft at suppressing armed attacks and using security challenges to justify the creation of a police state, nonviolent action often catches these regimes off guard. Through what Sharp calls political jujitsu, social movements can turn repression into a weakness for those in power. Violent crackdowns against unarmed protests end up exposing the brutality of a ruling force, undermining its legitimacy, and in many cases, creating wider public unwillingness to cooperate with its mandates. Does any of this sound familiar right now? definitely intentionally shared that one earlier as well.
Yes.
That one, Megan, and anyone in the comments. Let's see.
Yeah, like first of all, political jujitsu is something we'll get back to later. So you guys definitely remember that term. I feel like I'm teaching. But I just remember like reading this and being like, oh my God, this is so perfect for right now. Like, this is exactly what we're seeing. And it's what we saw in, the civil rights movement of the past. Like, you would see the police brutality and people would get mad at the police, and it would actually help the cause rather than hurt it, really, because then people are like, you can't treat them like that, and like, it's interesting because I feel like now with social media and the media in general, it's kind of like, yeah, sure, you see the outrage, but then you also see the other side of it, of like people defending the police actions as well. Do you know what I mean? Like, depending on what fits their cause. So yeah, I just remember reading this and being like, oh my God.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just there's like a power in like defining something and seeing it as clearly like for what it is. So obviously like they have to like discuss the difference between nonviolence and violent rebellions, and so I just thought that was just really poignant, like pointing out how using violence has a strategic weakness in a sense. And we're going to get into all the ways that nonviolent uprisings have don't lack weakness. What's the opposite?
Yeah.
Have very interesting strengths.
Yeah.
And I just like that can turn. Let's say, political jujitsu, social movements can turn repression into a weakness for those in power. So, I think we're all kind of like seeing that right now. So I feel like there's not even that much we need to add to it. Like,
Yeah.
we
and
all.
Daniel said there are literal pages upon pages dedicated to the police brutality occurring daily. Yeah. And what's insane to me, this part like later on in the book, is they're talking about different countries, right? I think it was Italy, talking about police officers showing up in unmarked vehicles in Italy and throwing people into the cars, and you'd never see or hear from them again. And I was like, oh, I'm reading about Italy. I thought I was reading about America. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's just like, they are literal pages dedicated to it. And it's very interesting.
Yeah. So it's just like, what are the ways that we can use that nonviolent action can be like actually really smart, like that's something that's interesting. So do you want to read this?
Well, I was going to actually say, I feel like that's actually kind of a good segue real quick to define what we mean, or what Gene Sharp means by nonviolent action versus a nonviolent conflict, which I'm trying to find on that page. There it is.
On page 8.
Yes, I see it now. I actually highlighted it. I promise I have good reading comprehension skills, you guys. Okay, I guess he doesn't actually define it.
Well, so he talks about Gene Sharp. So Gene Sharp begins using the term nonviolent action or nonviolent conflict.
Oh, right, because he doesn't like using just nonviolence by itself.
Yeah. Some academic researchers studying strategic nonviolence influenced by Sharp have made a further break in terminology. They now discuss campaigns of unarmed popular action simply as civil resistance.
Yes.
A formulation that is notably free of pacifist association.
Yes, because when you hear the term nonviolence, it just sounds, what's the word I'm looking for? Not pacifist, but non-confrontational, I guess. And non-confrontation just seems like you're not going to get much done. And so he then coined the terms nonviolent action and nonviolent conflict.
Yeah, which is why I should have written in that they started using civil resistance instead. Mm-hmm. So the next quote is where it goes into civil resistance. So do you want to read that one, Megan?
Yes. Finding it on my page.
What is civil resistance?
At their core, the principles of civil resistance are inherently democratic. Nonviolent campaigns require mass public support and participation if they are to succeed. And then later on it says, what Lerner says of unions applies equally to large environmental organizations, human rights groups, and other nonprofits. They are just big enough and just connected enough to the political and economic power structure to be constrained from leading the kinds of activities that are needed for bold campaigns of nonviolent conflict to be successful.
So earlier it says principles of civil resistance are inherently democratic. Nonviolent campaigns require mass public support and participation if they are to succeed. So we know that like you need some sort of mass organized body in order to like successfully have a civil resistance.
Yes.
But the book is going to get into, and what this quote kind of talks about is the sort of spectrum of what that is, like what is that organizational body, like what do you need, how can it function effectively. So it's talking about being just big enough is kind of important, and it goes back to like what we were talking about in our last book with the what's it called, the women's welfare rights movement. So anyway, maybe let's keep moving, and I think we'll define that a little bit better once we get into chapter 3. Yeah. So chapter 2 is called Structure and Movement. And this is where we start to like learn more about, how to take action, and like there's like more like steps on that. So on page 38, one of the quotes we underlined was, activists and movement types are mobilizers and entertainers, not democratic organizers. Their script is their persona and their cause. And then on page 40, periodic mass euphoria around a charismatic leader is not an organizer. It's just the initial stage of agitation. So this is like talking about, it's kind of interesting because he like kind of shits on activists. But they kind of like say like, like there's a difference between just being someone out there who's like creating awareness or like drawing attention to an issue. Like that's important. But this as kind of like a social science is saying like, that's not necessarily what actually creates change,
Yeah.
What creates change is like regular people on the ground in their own communities, assessing a problem, like seeing something for what it is, and then doing something about it,
Yeah.
Which I found really interesting because we have this culture that really like, idolizes people. And obviously like you can have someone like Martin Luther King who like was that idol, but it wasn't just Martin Luther King, it wasn't just, him. It was like this whole movement that he was a part of.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of also important to make that distinction. So yeah. And then the last one is like important that I think is a good transition to chapter 3. You want to read the last one?
Is that the one on page 46?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I got a little lost. We tend to highlight different things because different things catch our attention. So I'm like trying to find like where you're reading. Okay. Because organizations have to worry about self-preservation, they become averse to risk-taking. Yeah, every time I saw something pertaining to that particular topic, I underlined it or I highlight. So I would highlight it because it's very interesting, because, organizations I think it was back on page, I was looking at it on page 40, I think. Anyways, earlier. Sorry, guys. I wish I had remembered it. Anyways, sometimes organizations, because they have to worry about the self-preservation, become averse to risk-taking. So they can't take the risks that are needed because they're too worried about, it gets into this in the book later, but they're too worried about the politics of it. Or they're too worried about, for example, when we read Tyranny of Kindness, they're too worried about losing funding. And they have all of these things that they have to risk, and it's kind of not, the risk versus the reward is not as great for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just don't end up taking as many risks. And yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. It just made me think about how I'm well, all these amazing organizations exist. How come there hasn't been more change? And then I read that and I was like, that's really interesting, So all these, I think we put a lot of, we don't have trust in institutions, yet we also put trust in institutions,
Yeah. Later in that paragraph too, it says, for the labor movement example, he says mass strikes lead to unions, but unions don't necessarily lead to mass strikes. And that's a paraphrase, but I was yeah, exactly. A lot of times these strikes you think about at universities, for example, students will strike and then they're trying to form a union, right? So yeah, I thought it's definitely very interesting.
Yeah, should we put up maybe this might be taking a step back, but
yeah,
Stephen's comment. Hi Stephen, thanks for joining. MLK, John Lewis, and other leaders in the civil rights movement planned, prepared, and trained for years. Obama and other speakers at Memorial for Lewis talked about that. Yeah. It was even interesting. There was a point in the book where they tell a story about a woman who, in the South, sits on the back of the bus. Not sits on the back of the bus, goes to the front of the bus and sits in the front of the bus, and is asked to move, and she doesn't. The police are called. This whole thing, and it's not Rosa Parks.
Mm-mm.
And so you read this story and you're like, oh, this is, they're telling the story of Rosa Parks. It's not Rosa Parks. And then they say this happens before, this had happened. I'm guessing that there was some sort of documentation because it was apparently a real person. I forget their name. But it was just so interesting. I was talking about how even just going into the civil unrest, the way that we remember history is, it's the things that lead up to it. But then of course, it took that all, it was saying, they were saying they told the story of this person and said, it probably happened countless times before. People had done it,
yeah.
People
but it just wasn't the right, it just wasn't the right time.
Yeah. And then Rosa Parks does it, and then it was at the right time in the right place. And then there happened to be this organization that was able to sweep in and put in. And then it talks about also, which I don't think we have this down, but I remember how to the T, the civil rights movement would plan what time people were getting on the buses, how long it took to get from one stop to this other stop, the place, how much it would, who was willing to go to jail and who wasn't, how much it would cost to bail certain people out of jail. It wasn't just okay, we're all going to go out and sit in the front of the bus. It was so much more thought through than I had ever realized. So I thought that was really interesting. So this whole chapter really just gets into, it's called Structure and Movement. So I think we're good to move on to chapter 3, which is my favorite chapter. Unless you have anything else. Anyone else have anything from chapter 2 that they want to share?
Yeah. I do just want to say, one of the important things that they say is, I know we kind of said, organizations, oh, they can't take risks. But, there is a difference. I think I want to point out that, on page 50, Piven says, organizations are not movements, but organizations can institutionalize and legalize the gains won through those movements, essentially. And so you kind of need, you do need both. You know, you need the organization and the institutional structures, but then you also need the mass movements. And all of that. So I think that's like important to say because, you know, the whole chapter is called structure and movement. So I think it is important to say that like both are important.
Right. Thank you, Manny. Can always count on you, reader friend. Yeah, I thought it was Claudette Colvin. So, you know, and people before her had, you know, done the same thing. So, so yeah, so let's move on to chapter 3. So chapter 3 is called The Hybrid. So the rest of the book, it's these things that are defined in chapter 2 and 3 about like structure versus fluidity, which is a big, like those are two foundational ideas that the rest of the book builds on. And I really loved chapter 3 because it gets into, if you haven't read it, it gets into the story of this organization movement. Would you call it an organization?
Kind of, yeah.
Called Otpor, which I think means, I forget what it means. It means something in Serbian, but it was a movement to overthrow essentially the dictator in Serbia. And this was happening in like the 90s, I think. And it's a fascinating story. I would want to read a whole book on this history. And I didn't know much about it. And like the comment, you know, what I was saying earlier, this is the one where I felt like there's like such a charge to this story. Reading about how Otpor functioned, this is the chapter where I'm like, yang, listen in, you know, like, there's I think a lot of similarities, definitely a very different goal, but it was the one that I felt personally like resonated. Right now. Yeah. On paper, a different goal. So anyway, so if anyone had any thoughts on chapter 3, please put them in the comments. So it's called The Hybrid because, you know, it focuses on like an organization, but the way that they functioned was very, very critical to how they were able to do what they did. So essentially, you know, they would do stuff like, or first of all, they didn't have a leader. That was one of the things that I thought was really interesting. They would specifically like alter people who could kind of be seen as leaders. And what their focus on instead was training people in communities, making chapters, and then doing like nonviolent or civil resistance within communities, taking advantage of the moment, and allowing people within chapters, allowing people to be well educated in the goals, but empowering them to take action on their own. Right. It's kind of like, it like makes me think of like hive mentality a little bit, but in a positive way. Yeah. Like not in a negative way, you know, in this like actually functioning hive society, I guess. So yeah, let's see. So the first quote I have from this chapter. At a time when many people did not believe anything could be done to confront the regime, Otpor deployed its members to carry out hundreds of small actions that conveyed a sense that resistance was possible. So I think this is important because, like, you're talking about a country that is like under a dictator, and that's got to be, you know, a tough bridge to cross. And so I thought it was really interesting that, the way that they got started was like start small. They would like claim little victories within their own communities. So I said restart at end of paragraph. So this is page 67. Sorry, didn't say that earlier. So let me see if I can find that.
They're all kind of funny. I love that they kind of draw with the humor of it.
Yeah. Maybe that's what this is. Let's see. What did I say? Restory end of paragraph.
Hi, Dino. Thanks for stopping by. The whole thing is funny. You could pick any of the stories within that paragraph and the paragraph below.
Yeah. So this one says, okay, listen it. This one's funny, guys. When authorities in the city of Novi Sad tried to surround their post-war reconstruction efforts with official pomp, even though the new bridge the government constructed over the Danube River amounted to little more than a temporary pontoon, activists responded by ceremoniously building their own toy bridge over a pond in one of the city's central parks. The stunt left authorities with two bad options: look cartoonishly repressive by arresting people for playing around with a styrofoam prop, or let Otpor continue to mock the regime. I love it. So if that didn't quite make sense, like essentially like they were like the government or whatever was trying to like build a bridge and it was really shitty, and they were like clearly they're not creating a society that's thriving, and so that's a big reason why they're trying to have the whole movement in the first place. And so they saw an opportunity there. So what they did was they just like created a like toy like mock-up of the bridge they were building like over this little pond as like a form of symbolic protest. And then this is back to the original quote from I think chapter 1 of like, when you have a dictatorship, if you try to fight it by force, you're like fighting under their rules. But if you don't use their rules, use something that's funny, that's smart or intellectual or something like that, it's like they can't function. Like they don't have a capacity for like fighting that back, other than like he says, arresting them, which is like, what's illegal about that? There's nothing illegal about, building a like little like style. It's like, it's an art piece,
Yeah. Well, what's really funny, I'm going to read this next one because I think this one's funny too. Because it's funny about like, well, we can't arrest them for like creating art. So in the next paragraph, they literally arrest a barrel. So what they do is, in another now famous prank in Belgrade, a troop of activists placed a steel barrel emblazoned with Milosevic's, who is the dictator, image on a busy walkway in one of the city's central pedestrian shopping centers. Next to it, they placed a baseball bat. Signs invited onlookers to either drop a coin into the barrel for his retirement fund, or if they did not have a coin because of his economic policies, they could take a whack at the barrel. Within 15 minutes, a large crowd had formed of shoppers eager to take turns at bat. Police soon arrived on the scene, but finding no evidence of the activists, they were not sure whom they should arrest, so eventually they took the barrel itself into custody. Just like I thought about that one for a while. I was like, he literally arrested a barrel.
Yeah. Which also makes them look dumb. So.
Yes.
Not a good look, guys. Yeah. So there's something effective about that. And then, that could, especially now, like that's like prime viral video.
Yeah. And they were saying like, they might not have like gotten them, in conventional politics, it might have seemed like, a loss for them. Like it didn't do anything, but they got some really good publicity, right? And it got sympathy from the public because the public's like, oh, you guys are so dumb. Like, like it's so funny, Daniel. I'm telling you, like I laughed so hard. I was like, they arrested a barrel. Like I was laughing for like 5 minutes. I was like, what the heck? So anyways,
Yeah.
I just thought it was cool because they're a bunch of college kids. So, being in a movement doesn't mean you have to be like serious all the time. Like they did this like dumb prank, but it proved their point, and it caused the public to be like, well, you guys are dumb. Like, but vote for, you guys are smart. Like, let me hear about your cause, like, what do you guys have to say?
It probably was great for bringing people into the movement, because it's like, there's some people who are just like, like they're just not about, they have this idea in their head of what, like they think people who do movements or whatever you call that, I do movements, who fight for change, are like really intense, radical people. And you're like, that's not my people. And then you do something where it's like, oh, it's like a prank, it's like, and
it's so dorky, right? Like, yeah. I just thought that like that part really tickled me. Like, it's just very funny.
Lots of great stories. So so if you want to, taste of why we enjoyed this chapter and enjoyed reading about Otpor, there you have it. And so let's see. And then this is a quote that I also talked about at one point, I think, in a Sunday Reads. So we're sharing quotes on the page throughout the month. And we also are doing Sunday Reads, guys, where we discuss the book of the month kind of throughout the month. So it's not just down to one conversation. So this is one I shared earlier. This is really, we can really like get into like the nitty gritty of Otpor. So it's on page 78. For Otpor's members, autonomy was the rule. Activists could form their own chapters in their schools or communities. They could call a rally, coat their town square with resistance posters, or stage their own guerrilla theater production. The possibilities were endless. So I know we just spent all that time talking about, the funny stuff, but they were doing lots of other things. And like, this is just kind of like a short list. And I obviously like the idea of like a guerrilla theater production. Like, I don't even know what that is. Are you okay, Megan? You look like you're troubled.
I was trying to find it on the actual page and I can't find it.
So anyway, so like, I don't know, think about that, guys. Like, like there's like creative ways. Like, I just like that this, it's not just like, okay, let's just go be angry somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's all sorts of ways that you can express discontent or dissent. And that's like clearly was something that Otpor was good at.
Yeah.
So we also, this is a thing that would be helpful, I guess, if we were to share this, if you guys are interested in that.
So it's page 72. That's why I couldn't find it.
Oh, it's not page 78? Sorry.
No, I like, that too, because I kept looking at it. I mean, you saw my face. I was literally like, where is it? I feel so dumb right now.
No.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. Page 72 on that last quote, which I even like kind of knew because I had shared it earlier. Anyway, so in our notes, Megan, maybe we should get into some more like examples of this, the bullet points I wrote. Do you have that?
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's really good.
So what we did was we tried to like condense a nice list of things that the authors talked about in this chapter that give you a really good idea of how this particular organization functioned. So yeah, do you want to read them?
Yeah. So did we read the quote from page 73?
I think we can go back to that one.
Okay. I was gonna say it's kind of important because like talks about habits, which is why you do the mass training. But earlier, Kateri kind of mentioned the mass training and like why that's really important. And so you just want me to read the list?
Yeah.
Okay. So mass training would allow them to quickly engage with new supporters, which is important, turn casual participants into committed members, continually upgraded the skills of their activists, utilized public displays, pranks to bring people in. Their courses would be 10 or more hours long over the course of a week. So they would do like Monday through Friday, like 2-hour sessions in the evenings. And these were designed to empower participants to operate in their own autonomous local chapters. So the movement was like a big tent. And this was important because it's kind of, Giselle brought this up at one point, it's kind of, you want almost a religious fervor around your cause. But then you also want the skills to be able to make that cause happen. And then you also want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. You want to know what you're fighting for. For example, Yang Gang loves UBI. And so we all learned about UBI. We learned it so well that if we were talking to somebody, we could explain it to them, right? And so that's what OPOR was kind of doing, is they were like, if we're going to be doing this, we have to do this right, and everybody has to be on the same page. And so that's what the mass trainings would allow them to do.
Yeah, I really like the idea of like autonomy and empowerment. That, like all you really is like, it's so cool. It goes to show like all you really need is like a seed, like you just need that that basic idea and the training that goes around it. Probably some hard and fast rules of like, like say like, okay, like we don't use negative words, like we don't engage in like violent, of course, or, like negativity or something like that, like Yang Gang, like we had humanity first, and it wasn't, I like, like that wasn't created with the intention of like being a really like a pillar of a movement, but it ended up becoming that. And so much of what, the Yang Gang was doing when we were like, during the campaign and stuff, it was under this concept of humanity first. So it's like, it goes to show how important those things are. And like, I don't think we really saw it fully for what it was, but it's like, if we hadn't had that, it might have been a slightly different picture, So I think it's important to understand, like how I feel like you don't necessarily need a ton, like all this structure, like social media manager and like, I don't know, like, I mean, probably that could be helpful too, of course, but this is like grassroots at its purest. You don't need all these bells and whistles. You need a goal, and you need some structure around that goal, and then disseminate that to people effectively. That's kind of all they did. Yeah.
And it was effective. It was very effective.
Yeah. Got a lot of media attention. Everything that they did got a lot of media attention, which made more and more people and then it got like journalists, movie stars, other politicians even. It created this like climate of, change is happening. This is not okay. We're doing something about this. So do you want to get back to the 73, page 73, negative habits?
Yes.
So I'll read this one. So this next quote, as we kind of round up our chapter 3 discussion. Negative habits get passed along with positive ones. Often the same tactic that worked at the launch of a movement gets replicated again and again, long after it has lost its novelty in the media and its ability to catch opponents off guard. So we had some specific thoughts when we reported this one down, but it's put in the chapter, I think, because they're trying to talk about the importance of fluidity and like being able to be flexible and adaptable. So there's an intelligence that needs to be incorporated to how you function. Like you have to constantly like reassess, like, what are we doing? Like, what is the purpose? How has the world changed? For instance, a lot of things changed for us in the last few months. Did you have any thoughts on that one?
Talking about the habits that kind of like pass down, One of the things I had highlighted, kind of like actually right at the end of the chapter, was, and this kind of goes into like, Kateri and I obviously we like run a book club. We're very big on like creativity and humor and art, and so like I think that's why we loved the Outpour movement so much. But at the end it says, successful nonviolent revolt always depends on local expertise and creativity, with the organizers closest to a struggle developing hybrids of their own. But you can spread skills and expand knowledge of a craft, and this can have important consequences. And that kind of goes back into it of like, the negative habits getting passed along with the positive ones, and going into like having those mass trainings so that you are passing along like the positive ones. And eventually you can kind of, it's a spread skills and knowledge of a craft, then the craft being nonviolent movements, right? And so you can kind of take Outpour's methods and then apply them to different movements.
Right. Yeah, because they're so bendable, right? So you can say, well, this worked for them, and we could see it working for us, but we don't think this would work for us. Yep. So I think that's very important, definitely. Okay, this is like
so good. I feel like I could just.
I know. I have one more. This is not something we have to talk about, discuss too deeply. This is just more of like, whoa, mic drop. So this is from one of the big organizers. Like I said, there's not like a leader of the Outpour movement, but one of the leaders said, "I have been in many countries after the failure of a mass protest, and that's when activists have the revelation. They need both protest and organization." So, like the protests are still happening now in the Black Lives Matter movement. But it's like, well, okay, so we need, that's happening, but what about the other half? So I think it's just really interesting. One of my big things when, a lot of stuff was happening, it's obviously still happening, but, when it was just starting, was to get on newsletters, like a lot of people say, make donations to these organizations. And in the back of my head, I was thinking about this book about how, like, well, some of these big organizations, like, aren't necessarily able to take risks. I'm not saying don't donate. Please don't.
Definitely donate if you can.
But I think it's helpful to have a more nuanced understanding of, that's like why we read books. So, I was kind of thinking about that. I was like, well, we'll do that because definitely, obviously, in order to like have lawyers and to reach more people, they need funds. But I was thinking, especially after having been running a book club for a while, I was like, really, like, get on the newsletter. Like, that's how are they able to have people power? Social media helps, so like follow them on social media, but you can disseminate a lot more information a lot more clearly, which is what we're talking about in this chapter, through like something like a newsletter or something, So anyway, so that was something that I did myself and would recommend doing. And maybe pretty soon we'll have our own newsletter.
We're working on it.
Okay, so what was chapter 4? I actually really like this chapter as well, the basic idea, which we don't have to spend too much time on this one, because we are only on chapter 3. Chapter 4, guys, is called The Pillars. So I'll start with this quote. Power still, well, it's kind of defining the idea of pillars of support. Okay, so it's kind of a definition. Power still resides in the general population's willingness to accept the legitimacy of a regime and to comply with its mandates. However, this power finds expression in institutions, both inside and outside the government, being military, media, business, community, churches, labor groups, civil service, educational establishment, courts, etc. These provide a regime with the backing it needs to survive. And not gonna lie, I searched through Mean Girls gifs for the longest time because this makes me think of how they took down Regina George. Couldn't find an appropriate one, unfortunately, but
we love a Mean Girls quote.
Yeah, this is like maybe the second time we have made a Mean Girls reference on.
It's like several times.
We're the same age, if you can't tell. Okay. So anyway, but yeah, so it's like, again, like a great thing about this book that it directs your vision to like something very concrete and specific that you can understand of like how you can incorporate it into your movement. So yeah, so basically the idea of like, it says later, I don't know if I even wrote it down, but like it says later, it's like dictators can't collect taxes themselves. Like they need an establishment, you know, a functioning chain of people power that are doing their dirty work.
Yeah.
So that's the basic idea of chapter 4. Let's see. Was there anything else from this chapter? True campaign.
I think the most important part of this chapter was the 3.5% rule. I think that's an important one. Yeah.
So that's an important idea, and this is also an important idea, guys. So we like math here, right? We support math.
We may not understand it, but we support it.
We understand this. This is, anyone can understand this.
Yes.
Okay, do you want to just talk about this one?
Yeah.
Go for it. While you're looking up.
Yeah, I was about to look at that one too. I was like, oh, that's a good idea. Because they talk about this.
About gay people pave the way for gay marriage, yes.
Yeah, the main thing that they're talking about in this chapter is the gay rights movement, for context for that. Okay, so I'm trying to look up page 107. Bam.
Interesting quote. I'll look at the comments. You do the thing.
There it is. Okay. Ooh.
Oh, do you need the page number?
I'm trying to find the 3.5% rule.
Look at the top of the page. I have page 110.
Ah, there it is. Yep, 110. Awesome. Okay. All right. So there is Chenoweth, who is one of the people that they talk about in here. She observed a trend that she would call the 3.5% rule, and this is what we want to talk to you guys about. So essentially, she found that no campaigns failed once they'd achieved the active and sustained participation of just 3.5% of the population, and lots of them succeeded with less far than that. But the 3.5% was kind of just like the trend that she mostly saw. And so essentially, if you do the math on that, right, in America, that is 11 million people.
Right. So it goes like there we go, guys. That's our goal. We're gonna get 11 million people
on board.
And we're golden. They did say that like some succeeded with less than 3.5%.
Yeah. But I think what's important is that with the 3.5%, you know, they also said that the reason civil resistance, so nonviolent resistance, is so good is because it allows people of all different levels of physical ability to participate, including the elderly, people with disabilities, women, children, and virtually anyone else who wants to. So 3.5% seems really hard, but only if you're going through things in like a militant way. But if you're trying to do things, you know, civil resistance, nonviolent resistance, all of that, there's so many people that can join in with that. You know, how many times have we seen pictures on Twitter, videos on Twitter of people of all kinds of abilities, ages, you know, protesting because you're able to do that, you know, or calling your congressperson. You need a phone, right? Emailing, you just, you know, get on your computer or borrow a computer. Writing letters, which is also important. Writing letters, okay, that's how I got into the Yang Gang. I wrote letters to potential supporters, you know. And so it's just like, you know, so 3.5% seems like a lot, but you can get essentially the whole population involved.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's nice. It's definitely nice to like have that number. It gives you this less sense of like you're in this kind of void, like yelling at the void, kind of like, I hope this lands. I hope, you're probably still gonna feel that a little bit, but yeah, I thought that was just like a really, it's definitely very Yang Gang to include some math and some data and stats into our, how we progress. This is kind of going on back to another comment, but a way to do, I think definitely an effective way to achieve 3.5% is when you recruit, infiltrate TV, movies, bring in cultural figures, for sure. So yeah. Oh yeah, like I recently watched the Zac Efron show, what's it called, Down to Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, like people it's gonna get a lot of criticism for a lot of different reasons. But the one thing you can definitely say is like the youth right now are some of the biggest climate change activists. And if that movement can grow, and someone like, Zac Efron or like some sort of celebrity figure is going to be like really taking it on. And I think, it's not like he just did like an Instagram post. Like it's like a whole show, and it like does, and like people are going to watch it because it's Zac Efron. And that in that way, it's like people are able to see how, the different ways that, like we can orient society, and in the different ways that people are impacted. And there's like a whole episode on Puerto Rico, which was really interesting. So it's like, it's important.
Mm-hmm.
They don't often go about it always in the best ways, but it can still be like that spark to, bring a mass amount of people in. And the youth have a ton of power, way more power than I think that they realize.
They realize it. They know.
Just got to get on board. A la Dave Chappelle, Childish Gambino. Yes, we love them. Yeah, great stuff. Okay, so chapter 5. Let's go to chapter 5. Some very interesting stuff in here as well. It's called Declare Victory and Run.
Yeah.
Even some funny stuff in here too, actually.
And this is talking about Gandhi, by the way. This chapter focuses on Gandhi, just to give context for the quotes that we have.
Yeah, so we actually jump quite back in time for this one. Mm-hmm. But I think the reason why he chose Gandhi, we're 45 minutes in, is because Gandhi used a lot of spiritualism and symbolism in the movement. And that's kind of ends up becoming significant. And well, first, they make the point that of how you define victory. And this actually goes back to our original conversation with Giselle about how these movements take so much time in order to, change does not happen overnight. And so let's see, where was the one that got into the story? Was it the first one? Tactical arsenal or made convincing case they've succeeded. Okay, I'm just going to read it. If a drive allows activists to fight another day from a position of greater strength, with more members, superior resources, enhanced legitimacy, and an expanded tactical arsenal, organizers can make a convincing case that they have succeeded, regardless of whether the campaign has yet made significant progress in closed-door bargaining sessions. So this is, basically talking about how, okay, so let's maybe just tell a story. So essentially, Gandhi does the Salt March.
Yep, Salt March.
And they do this whole march all the way to the coast. And they just go in the water, and they're just
they collect the salt because at the time the British government had control of the salt production and the salt
Mm-hmm.
economy of salt.
Yeah.
They controlled it. And so
Indigenous people weren't allowed to mine for salt. Like
yeah,
you had to buy salt from like, I don't know. I guess it's from there, but it's like
yeah,
resold through the British. It's like ridiculous. It's
yeah.
absolutely ridiculous.
And Gandhi was like, let's just go to the ocean and get the salt. Like,
Get the salt. Yeah, but they walked there, so it created garnered a lot of attention.
200 miles.
And that was kind of what started it. And then Gandhi ends up getting into actual negotiations with the British, with the colonizers. And what was really interesting is that he doesn't really succeed. He doesn't really get what he gets very, very minimal winnings. I forget even what it was.
I think it was people who were living in poverty, like during under a certain poverty line, were allowed to mine their own salt, but everybody else had to
only a little bit. Yeah, only a little bit. Yeah, so it was a very tiny little win, and so he got a lot of.
Oh, Daniel.
Yeah,
we have a very similar sense of humor. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Contributing to our content. So Gandhi was like criticized for that. But the book really makes the distinction that the win was not getting what they wanted. The win was the precedent of an Indian man going to the British and having negotiations at all, right? The fact, it like broke a barrier, we talk about like the glass ceiling. You talk about, these lines that, minorities, marginalized people have been put behind, and you got to break the barrier, right? So that was kind of his point in telling the story, was that Gandhi successfully broke the barrier, and it ends up becoming a more symbolic thing. So I think it's kind of good to like talk about that, because in the beginning, in the introduction, they talk about how like just for the sake of symbolism, like a protest just for the sake of symbolism isn't necessarily going to get you anywhere. But in this case, we see that, but it can. So, it all comes down to context. It all comes down to where, when, who, what, why, how. Anyway, so I thought that was really interesting. I like some good symbolism, personally.
Can you tell we're writers? And it kind of says that, the next one that you have here, from page 132, that quote.
Yeah.
The use of symbolically loaded demands and the acceptance of settlements that adhere to the Gandhian rule of the minimum consistent with the truth are not hard and fast tenets in momentum-driven organizing. Instead, they represent some of the approaches that activists have taken in addressing a broader issue, what might be called framing the victory.
Right. Yeah. So two things there. We have the minimum consistent with the truth, and we have framing the victory. So those were things that really stuck out to me. So do you want to explain the minimum consistent with the truth before I read this story?
I'm trying to find it on the page. So you guys, just so you know, the reason I'm lost, Kateri did the notes for the first half of the book, and I did it for the second half of the book.
We're going to spend most of our time on my half. Okay. I'll do it, and then you read the story on the 139. It's like at the very top of 139.
Got you.
So minimum consistent with the truth, because I can just explain that really quickly, is so Gandhi I'm not an expert here, but basically it seems like Gandhi has this philosophy of you want to always have this kind of seed of what you want to achieve, that is truthful. It's still truthful to your movement. It's still part of its DNA in a way, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all this all this stuff. That's the kind of the way I understood it. If any of you read that and have something to add to that definition, pop it in the comment section. So anyway, so then we talk about declare victory and run, right? Is that what it was? Is that what the
Framing the victory.
Framing the victory, yeah, sorry. I thought that was wrong. So framing the victory. So this is kind of this is like a fun tip, right? For like how you can kind of manipulate the story around what it is that you're doing and the trouble you're making. Did you find the story, or do you want me to read it?
You can read it. You can read it.
Okay, so on 139. There's a kind of a long. Okay, so I'll give you the context. They're basically trying to just do a classic like stop traffic. So they're doing a protest to stop traffic. I think this is actually Otpor. Yes, so this is an example again from the Otpor movement. And so they're just trying to like stop traffic and like get some media attention, and that's it. What the activists conveniently neglected to mention was that they carried out their protests at a time of the day when traffic was at a lull and relatively few vehicles were affected. Moreover, their blockade held for all of 15 minutes, long enough to take some decent photos, but not so long that the cops had time to bust the participants. These details did not prove to be a problem. The activists had indeed blocked the highway, just as they had promised, and they could mark another win in their leisure, although the triumph they claimed fell far short of the final goal of ousting Milosevic. It effectively inspired greater defiance. So it's kind of like this tactic of like, set smallish goals and just find a way to make it work and like get some media attention, and that can work, I thought that was really interesting. So yeah. Where are you, Meghin?
Oh, I was in the chat helping out with a question. I just threw one of the other quotes in there.
Cool. So, any thoughts so far, guys? Interesting stuff.
I like once we move into chapter 6, this one, I feel like the last half of the book, I feel like the first half was more so like all of these stories. And then the second half I kind of felt like was more so of a, not textbook, because it's not like they have like bolded terms or anything, but it was almost laid out like, here's some definitions, here's how you do it. Here's this, here's how you do it. Yeah. And that's kind of, so the second half will be a little bit easier to move through because it's more so like defining things. Here's what you do. This is, I feel like, when you really get into the manual part of the book, like it turns into kind of like the manual. Yeah. But first, sorry. I said this to the wrong person. Didn't mean to say Jackie, I meant to say Arena. She said, so what would our definition be of a victory? On page 135, we had a quote, and it says, you don't wait for someone to grant you victory or somebody to concede, you have to claim it. So essentially, as a movement, you decide what the victory is. And that goes back into the story that Kateri told. It was a victory for them. It doesn't matter that they didn't really disrupt anything. To them, it was a victory because they did what they said they were going to do. Yeah. So you have to kind of declare your own victory.
Yeah, I think there's something about just like speaking things into action, or I don't know, just like saying like, I don't know, like a small goal of like, we're going to try to get 250 people onto our newsletter, and it's not that many people, and you maybe don't even set like a time goal, and then you do it, and then you say, we did it, we had our 250 like newsletter, growth. That's kind of an example of like how you can, and what it does is it helps build momentum for your movement. So yeah. Meghin, I can handle the comments if you want to like get into some of your notes here for the latter half of the book.
Okay. All right. So chapter 6 is called The Act of Disruption. And it's exactly what it's talking about. And we actually get into exactly like what disruption is. So the first thing I have is on page 145. Time and again, in uprisings that steal the spotlight and illuminate injustices that are otherwise ignored, we see three elements: disruption, sacrifice, and escalation, combining in forceful ways. And so I kind of just condensed exactly what all of those things are. So disruption is described as the first key factor in pushing outbreaks of revolt into the headlines. So that's on page 145. He also says, our power is in our ability to make things unworkable, argued prominent civil rights organizer Bayard Rustin. The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn. And I kind of liked that kind of like picture. Mm-hmm. So essentially, like when you're part of a movement, people who are part of a movement don't necessarily have the most resources. They don't have the money, but we have ourselves, and so part of disruption is exactly like the story Kateri told. That was disruption. You do something that makes things inconvenient for people, and then they listen to you. So it's like disruptive nonviolent protest is a way to get attention. And then Sharp actually goes into some of these methods. There's three. There's protest and persuasion. So this is like what we tend to see the most often. Exactly what it means, protest. It's minimal disruption. Methods of non-cooperation. So that would be economic boycotts, student walkouts, workplace strikes. And we even saw a little bit of the economic boycotts within the Black Lives Matter movement. There was a whole day where people were saying, don't buy anything online, or just buy from Black-owned businesses. And that kind of thing worked. Martin Luther King and the SCLC, right? Is that what it's called? The South Carolina or Southern Christian Leadership Convention. They did that. And they actually ended up like not shopping in this one like area downtown, and it really messed up that area downtown. And they got done what they wanted to get done, which was desegregation.
Right.
And then the third one would be nonviolent intervention. So that's sit-ins, land seizures, and civil disobedience. And so those are kind of the three. But then they also go into, on page 148, they talk about, although tactics that interrupt business as usual are the most likely to draw attention, this attention is not necessarily positive. Because these actions inconvenience people and create disorder, they risk inviting a negative response, backlash that can reinforce status quo injustice. Therefore, the use of disruption places activists in a precarious position. In crafting scenarios for political conflict, they must carefully cultivate sympathy, working to ensure that observers recognize the legitimacy of their cause. Strategic judgment is needed to maximize the transformation potential while at the same time minimizing backlash from the public. So it's kind of like garnering sympathy while also doing these destructive, but not super destructive, but destructive methods, and kind of keeping that sympathy, which we're seeing, play out.
Right. We have a question. How you can win a race with little money. You were talking about AOC. Yeah, so definitely possible. It's people power, right? People power.
And then the second thing to go into would be sacrifice. So one main way of doing this is through showing a willingness to endure hardship, to face arrest, or even to risk physical harm in dramatizing an injustice. So sacrifice, that means potentially getting arrested, that means losing things. There was one example in particular of the civil rights sit-ins when they were trying to desegregate the lunch counters.
Mm-hmm.
And so a bunch of students just went in and just sat at the lunch counters together. They literally just sat there. Right. And kind of their sacrifice was, I mean, they got milkshakes poured on their head. They got the cops called on them. And they ended up being the ones that got arrested, even though they were literally doing nothing except sitting, And so you have to kind of be prepared. With the disruptive techniques comes the sacrifice.
Right. Even in our last month's book, in our last month's book, and we had Teresa on, the author, and they talked about, this was the welfare rights movement. Mm-hmm. They would, and like talked about this earlier about what would happen in the civil rights movement, that they would decide like who's gonna get arrested, like who, like that was it was strategic of like who was gonna get arrested. And Teresa like kind of talks about how like she had been arrested multiple times and how like it was still a sacrifice, like they would do it and they knew it was a necessary thing, a necessary sacrifice. But even then, like, she still, like, it's like one thing to be like, yeah, I'm gonna fucking go in there, and she's like, and then it's another thing to like be in there and like just like, and, like you don't know what's gonna happen. Like something bad could happen, like, so it's like, it's like sacrifice is real. And we've definitely seen, we've seen, and that is in our history books, like we've seen the sacrifices that, at least Americans have made in order to have equality. So, it's an interesting concept, I think, to have as, Yanging people. It's not like, like how much are we willing to sacrifice?
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that sacrifice or repression can actually help a movement. Right. And if you guys remember the term political jiu-jitsu, that's basically what this is the idea that repression can actually help a movement rather than hurt it is a notion that stands a conventional understanding of power on its head. And yet, the ability of nonviolent demonstrators to benefit from the zealousness of authorities is a well-studied occurrence within the field of civil resistance. This phenomenon is commonly described as political jiu-jitsu. So essentially, it's saying that when you have nonviolent demonstrations, such as what we've seen with Black Lives Matter, I'm just bringing up the most recent that, we have actually seen. Mm-hmm. You see these protesters, and then you see the violence that is then enacted on those protesters by the authorities.
Right.
And that actually garners sympathy for the protesters, and actually helps their cause. And so that's basically what political jiu-jitsu is using their violent tactics against them.
Right. Exactly. Let's see, more comments. Yeah, I definitely think that using intellectualism and being smart and pragmatic, that's a huge strength to any movement. You can also identify different people to play roles. Some people can afford to be arrested because they are retired or self-employed. Yeah, very good point. That is essentially what they were doing with the women's rights movement.
This one, actually, John Lewis was the guy in one of the sit-ins that he got arrested several times.
Yeah.
Definitely, a big model for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So, would you guys be willing to sacrifice things? Who here would be willing to go to jail?
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. When you think about these things and you're like, do I really believe in this cause? And when you ask yourself if you'd be willing to go to jail or be willing to even like not even jail. Jail is like a big thing.
Yeah.
But think about even sacrificing your relationship with your family.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Sacrificing friendships, sacrificing money by donating, sacrificing your personal space by taking people in. There was that story of, I think it was a guy in DC who just took a bunch of protesters into his home.
Yeah, right.
You know, he sacrificed his personal space and in his safety because he doesn't know any of these people. And the police then knew he was sympathetic, you know, and so it's kind of like sacrifice comes in many forms.
Yeah, definitely comes in many forms. We'll get more into, you know, topics of UBI once we, you know, get through all of our what we have prepared today.
I'm almost through chapter 6.
Chapter 6. And there's a couple that are definitely smaller, so we're almost there. So what would you like to focus on next, Megan?
So the last thing that they were talking about in chapter 6 was escalation, and escalation is kind of an important part, right, of a movement. So when social movement participants undertake disruptive actions, not once, but on an ongoing basis, endeavoring to carry out ever bolder displays of non-compliance over the course of a campaign, and that's escalation. And again, that's like when they were in the SCLC, when it was strategic escalation. They were escalating things on purpose to help their cause. And basically the last thing I wanted to focus on, because this made me think of the Yang Gang, was a quote on page 162 going into 163. Finally, momentum-driven organizing is attentive to ways mass mobilization might collaborate with structure-based institutions. It tries to draw further support from established groups that are ordinarily reluctant to risk disruptive activity. Many regulars at the Occupy encampments, in contrast, were so wary of co-optation that the movement missed opportunities to collaborate with constituencies outside of its countercultural base. So essentially, you know, the Occupy movement, which was Wall Street, right? They weren't able to further their movement at times because they weren't willing to work with other groups. And I think that's important for us as the Yang Gang, or just UBI supporters in general, that we need to be making sure that we are collaborating with people outside of our own communities.
Yeah. And it gets back to Otpor, because that was something that was distinguished as why they were successful, because they did do that, and how they did it, because they were aligning themselves with people that, you know, didn't completely agree with, is that they found something, like maybe one thing. Well, in this case, they found one thing that they could all agree on, which was get that guy out of there.
Yep.
You know, so it's like it's
possible. Or so help me, so help me.
What?
Sorry. I think that was Disney. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, like I feel like we kind of live in this culture of like, oh, you think that thing, you're evil, you're not woke.
Yeah.
I don't have time for you, you know?
Yeah.
And you know what, you know, I'm not gonna even say like that whole thing can get complicated, and like there can be certain things that, you know, like you learn something about someone and you're just like, no. But I think I think we have to distinguish between what's important for an individual and what's important for a movement. You know, like what is like really important for like one individual, of like this crosses a line or a boundary and I can't go there. Like that person has every right to think that, but a movement can't afford that. Is I think the point we're trying to make, you know? So it's like, so if you're in a movement, you have to be, that's like maybe even a sacrifice.
Yeah.
That you think of, you know, like, are you willing to sacrifice, you know, aligning yourself with someone who you don't completely agree with, like the ideology of something, of their politics or something, you know, like, are you willing to do that? Or are you going to stand alone and not get anywhere?
Yeah, exactly. You know, you kind of have to, a common goal, you know, you start to see that you can actually work with people when you do have a common goal. So I you know, and UBI, I think is so important, you know, since we're talking about like our causes, UBI is something that's so important. I don't think that we can afford to not collaborate with people outside of it, outside of the movement, you know?
Definitely. Does anyone agree? Does anyone disagree?
Nell agrees.
The movement. Yes.
Yeah. So that was chapter 6. I'm trying to move a little bit fast through these. But like I said, the last half of the book was definitely more so manual than it was story.
Yeah.
So chapter 7 is called The Whirlwind. I keep making jokes about this with Kateri because this is like in my my vernacular now.
Yeah.
But essentially, like, this is called The Whirlwind. And I'll just start by defining it. On page 177, the defining attribute of a movement of the whirlwind, or the moment of the whirlwind, is that it involves a dramatic public event or series of events that sets off a flurry of activity, and that this activity quickly spreads beyond the institutional control of any one organization. For example, we are kind of in the middle still of a moment of the whirlwind in a way, or at the tail end of it. And what happens is, for the whirlwind moment to happen, you have like trigger events. So for example, a trigger event could be something like George Floyd, right? That's a trigger event. Breonna Taylor, that's a trigger event. Many of these events happening in quick succession, and people saying, you know what, that's enough. Sorry, my computer's dying. This happens like at least once every month. But essentially, it's people saying, you know what, we've had enough. And then you're in this whirlwind. There's a flurry of activity that happens. There's protests that start happening across the country, you know, and people are getting involved in those protests. And it says, and this really made me think of the Yang Gang, page 178. Most long-term participants in social movements have experienced at least one such moment. Indeed, it is not uncommon to learn that they were first recruited into political activism during such an outbreak. When asked, they will typically recall with wonder the mysterious and invigorating atmosphere that existed at that time. And that made me think of the Yang Gang, because I felt like for a lot of us, the Yang campaign was a whirlwind moment. We all got caught up in like, you know, like I haven't been politically active, can't speak right, politically active in a while. But something about the Yang campaign, something about the Yang Gang as a group was just invigorating, right? And so that just really made me think about it.
Yeah, definitely. And so it's good to like, it's almost just like therapy, you know?
Yeah.
We need to be each other's therapists, you know, like acknowledge that that was a whirlwind. We're not in the whirlwind right now. We might not feel great about it. It's okay, you know, like we'll get there again. Like we'll keep going.
Yeah. Stephen brings up an interesting point though. For the UBI movement, they're at the start of the whirlwind. The pandemic, Floyd and Taylor, the economic collapse, the failure of Congress to pass further stimulus. Now is our time. That's a great point. You know, it's almost like when the whirlwind moment for one movement is ending, it's like beginning for the next.
Yeah. One door closes and another one opens. I like that a lot. Definitely great stuff. Yeah. And this kind of gets back to like the foundation that was set in the beginning of the book of like, you know, organizations need to be able, you need to have the skills and understanding of how to take advantage of the whirlwind.
Yes.
You know, you have to be able, you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to kind of make sacrifices as a movement. Like, you know, say like you had this campaign planned, but you might have to scrap it. You might have to go like quick back to the drawing board and figure something else out. If you can't do that, then it might hurt you.
Yep. And then you have to kind of then continue that, not momentum, but that impact of it after the whirlwind's gone and that moment has passed. You have to continue that. On page 195, Moyer says, the long-time impact of social movements is more important than their immediate material success. And that's true.
Mm-hmm.
The moment of the whirlwind passes, and what happens after that is what people are going to remember, because that is we were talking about this earlier, that is the legislation that gets passed. That is the change that is actually created.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So now we're on chapter 8.
Yes, the dividers.
Yes, and this one we don't have to spend too much.
No, I have like one quote from this one.
Cool. So what do we have for this one?
So this one is talking about the main group that this chapter is focusing on is ACT UP. So this was the AIDS activism and all of that. So the disruptors, and the reason they chose this is because ACT UP did a lot of things that were the dividers. They did a lot of things that seemed very divisive, but they got a lot of stuff done. So I think I have on here page 202. Yeah. Yes. Okay. As is characteristic of polarizing movements, ACT UP had a different effect on different groups of people. Most directly, it took a community at the center of the crisis, AIDS patients, their lovers and friends, and transformed them from passive victims into a potent political force. A growing number of disciplined activists found their voice within the working groups that emerged from ACT UP's decentralized structure. In short, the organization's high-profile actions and vibrant meetings generated a strong base of active public supporters. So essentially, this is just describing what they mean by the dividers. Sometimes when you do things, not everybody is going to like it. Is essentially, the main thing about this. So I actually said the main objective of this chapter is to get across that with nonviolent action within a movement comes backlash from people. The public may say, we don't like your methods, but we agree with your message. There's that quote that I posted one time about MLK about lukewarm acceptance, and how that's worse than just ignorant non-acceptance. Essentially, people will always tell you to wait for a more convenient time to protest. And you're like, but when is that time? So yeah. And then the last thing I wanted to say about this one, I think we both had not a lot to say about this chapter. But essentially, if a movement on page 223, but if a movement is to remain effective, it must be another thing as well, and that's disciplined. And so that leads us into chapter 9.
Yeah, I think we didn't have much to say about this because UBI is not necessarily, I think, the topic that you do want to. It's like, no, I'm not saying you don't want to have lukewarm acceptance, but we're not fighting against racism. I mean, we are, but we're not. So I think it's just it's this. UBI is interesting, where it's like this intellectual thing. And I've thought okay, what if maybe that would change if we changed a little bit and we were saying, well, we're fighting poverty. Then that gives us the ability to start doing things where you would probably it would make sense to do things that would maybe create some ruffled feathers. So yeah, maybe it's actually just the way that you frame your argument and frame your goals. So maybe something to think about.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's talk about discipline.
Yes. So the discipline. So this chapter, I actually really, really liked this chapter. Yeah. I loved this chapter. And I think one of the reasons I love this chapter is because there is a female hero. So this chapter focuses on Earth First, which was a environmentalist organization.
Is there
okay. I essentially just laid it out. So if you want to read the first one, because I feel like I was talking a lot. So okay.
So this one's on page 228. For movements to benefit from a state of heightened conflict, its participants must make sure of two things. First, that they are drawing in more active supporters than their opponents, and second, that even if their methods are perceived as extreme or impatient, the tide of public opinion is pushing toward greater acceptance of their views. So I think this is kind of like building also on the last concept of like, or like the idea of good trouble, kind of, you know, not always like, you're not trying to make friends. We're not trying to make friends here, you know, like, you know, yeah, like have coalitions. So make friends with people that can build your movement. But then with the public at large, sometimes you don't always want to have that philosophy. And I think it's kind of good to kind of give context here about, you know, we're talking about climate change, which, you know, there's a lot of money in climate change. I think that was big. I mean, anti-climate change. There's a lot of money in anti-climate change, right? And so we have it's an interesting context when you have workers of sometimes workers of like logging industry, coal industry, stuff like that, and you know that intermix with activists, climate change activists. And then in this context, we have a woman. What was her name? Berry. Judy. Judy Berry. Yeah, Judy Berry. So we have Judy Berry, who comes into these like really macho kind of like, I don't know why, I guess because they were loggers, like this. So the movement, this part of the movement, you know, has been started by these kind of like macho, really ideological. Was it ideological? You know, like they just like were kind of purist, I guess. Yeah. About their argument and what they had done so far, and she kind of broke that up. And she also was like, well, we've got to get organized. We've got to get disciplined. So, you know, an interesting thing, you know, not trying to say, you know, paint gender with a broad brush, but she definitely brought something that, you know, no one man or woman had brought yet. So yeah, so she was the one that really pushed the movement, I think, to like keep moving forward, and like get into good trouble, not be afraid to ruffle some feathers and keep at it. Right. Which one do you want to read next? You've got
yeah. So part of that, you know, again, bringing it back to like, on page 230, she said, there's no way that a few isolated individuals, no matter how brave, can bring about the massive social change necessary to save the planet. So we began to organize with local people, planning our logging blockades around issues that had local community support. So essentially part of that discipline is actually going out and organizing things with people, you know, planning their stuff around like local issues. And I was sharing in relation to UBI, I was telling Kateri this before the stream, but with UBI, for example, like UBI can be framed different ways depending on who you're talking to or what part of the country you're in. You know, and that's part of being disciplined, is having those ways to explain it to people in different areas, and then, you know, organizing things around like local issues. And that's part of having that discipline, because I think, you know, a lot of us in the Yin Gang and the UBI movement, a lot of us are young, and we want things now, and we have this like heightened, like, yes, let's do this. But you also have the discipline. You also have to have the discipline to organize and to kind of like not sit back and do nothing. I'm not saying that, but also realize that these things do take time, and you have to lay the groundwork. And that takes a lot of discipline.
Definitely. Great. So is there one you want me to read?
I think the next important thing was the quote from page 241, I think, because that kind of goes with today.
Yeah. Okay, so I can read it. Knowing that violence can cause harm to movements and provide an ideal pretext for repression, governments and reactionary groups have actively tried to encourage it, highlighting the tendency, Gandhi put forth a willfully counterintuitive proposition. For a member of a mass protest movement to resort to violence, he argued, was to cooperate with the government in the most active manner.
Yes.
Yeah. So kind of a core tenet of this whole conversation, really.
Yeah. The discipline to not fight back.
Yeah.
So essentially, the reason this part was so interesting to me was they talk about agent provocateurs.
Mm-hmm.
And those are people who attempt to instigate activity that damages the targeted movements.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen some examples of those within the Black Lives Matter movement. People who start looting.
Mm-hmm.
The guy, I forget where it was, but the guy who had the umbrella and the gas mask who caught a building on fire and then blamed BLM. Those are agent provocateurs. And it even said, like, in the United States, we don't hear about those a lot because we have the FBI and the CIA, and we don't hear about that, but it happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so we, as a movement, have to have like the discipline, which is hard, and this goes into sacrifice, but the discipline to then not fight back.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't it? It's like your patience is your sacrifice.
Yeah. And your physical, like, think about the people who, like, instead of fighting back, were just standing their ground and got hit with the rubber bullets and lost eyes.
Yeah.
Or people who got pepper sprayed, people who, all of these things. I saw one woman got like burned by one of the canisters, and so you might sacrifice like your actual physical body. But you have, part of that is the discipline to kind of just like not fight back, because then, like what Gandhi said, you're actually cooperating with the government because they want you guys to fight back. They want us to fight back. They're provoking it because if we fight back, then they're justified in arresting us, or they're justified in the physical violence that they enact. But if we don't fight back, then people look at that and they're like, oh my gosh, they're hurting these peaceful protesters. They're not doing anything. They're just standing there.
Yeah. And that's a really big thing. Like, if this, again, getting back to the idea of like, if this material were taught in schools, like that would be a huge, like, if it was more of just like ingrained in our culture from a younger age of the power of, of maintaining the nonviolence, even when things get violent or violence is instigated and it's not you.
Yeah.
I think that's a really, really important point.
Yeah. Sure. So the last one I kind of said was on page 249, creating discipline within a movement is at once a difficult task and an essential one. And that kind of goes back into what we were just talking about.
Which I think for us, like Yang Gang, it gets back to like humanity first, and like we calling each other out. Like when you see people who are not practicing humanity, because we operate largely on Twitter, that's a form of that right there. It's a smaller form, but very important. So we hold ourselves to that discipline.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we made it to chapter 10, the last chapter. This one's called The Ecology of Change. And this chapter, just for context, focuses on the overthrow in the Egyptian government.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. So, do you want me to read the first one?
Go for it.
On page 259 to 260. Structure-based organizing and momentum-driven movements are not inherently in conflict. Ideally, the two models can complement one another. Established groups that share the goals of a mass uprising can benefit from the burst of energy and the increased interest in a cause that comes with a high-profile mobilization. In turn, the more established organizations can lend their prestige and resources to outbreaks of resistance when they arise. I really like this quote because the book is like kind of at war with these different concepts, and it tries to bring them together in different ways. But at the end, this is a good example of how, it's better if you have both.
Yes.
You have like the ACLU, and then you have grassroots Black Lives Matter chapters,
Yeah.
So I really like that, and I like that framework to keep that in mind going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And essentially it all, the whole book kind of boils down to that. They kind of, we didn't really get into it, but in the book, they kind of go back and forth of like, oh, should we do structure-based organizing? Should we do momentum-driven movements? And then they kind of like give the pros and cons of both, just to say at the end that like, no, we need both. Like ideally, you need both.
Yeah. Typical writers.
Yeah. They did a really good job. Like this book isn't just like it's not just like a wealth of knowledge, it's also very well written.
Yes.
Very well written.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then on page 262, it kind of goes into that a little bit more. And it says, when mass mobilizations, established organizations, and alternative communities see themselves as complementary, they can create a movement ecosystem that allows diverse approaches to promoting change to flourish.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of goes back into like, each part has their own things that they can do. And all of that is important.
Yeah, and I like the use of the word ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Like diversifying your group, like your pool of bandwidth that you have, making sure that's really diverse, is a strength for many reasons. If you're going to be able to reach more people, you're going to have more sustainability. You're going to do more interesting things. So yeah, I think there's a lot to that one as well. Yeah. So let's see. I like this next one on page 274.
I was going to say, yeah, skip to that one.
In terms of pitfalls, one problem is that if the project of building alternative community totally eclipses attempts to communicate with the wider public and win broad support, it risks a type of self-isolation that limits its possibilities for creating social and political change.
And then I'm going to go ahead and read the next two so we can just talk about it.
Let's just bring all that together.
Yes. Page 275. Strong group identity, however, is a double-edged sword. The stronger the identity and cohesion of the group, the more likely people are to become alienated from other groups and from society. Isolated groups are hard-pressed to achieve political goals. So,
what do you guys think of that one, Yang Gang?
So, we have thoughts.
Does anyone else have thoughts? Yeah. I think we have work to do. I think there's definitely a lot we can be doing as far as moving the movement, and I think making sure that we have opportunities to continue the movement outside of Twitter, basically. Let's call it like it is.
Yeah.
Is really important here. So we have ideas with the book club. So as an example, like imagine using the book club as a way to keep your own local Yang Gang. So for instance, I've been in touch with Yang Gang on Twitter, but I haven't been as in touch with the people I've met here. And obviously the pandemic has had a lot to do with that. Yeah. But as we move into the future, imagine, getting your local Yang Gang together around making a book club chapter and growing it, because it's not just political. You just get the people together. You don't necessarily call it Yang Gang even. And bring in your friends who like to read. Bring your mom or your grandma even.
Yeah. My mom's involved.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. And use that as a place to like create a space where you can just talk about things, like just talking about things, creating discussions. That's how anything happens. Like you can't have a movement without talking about it first.
Yeah. I think Kat brings up a really good point. although YG is important, there may reach a point when simply having the name YG might limit how many in the general public join the movement. And I think that's really important. I think to us, our community is important to us because it gives us that group identity. It gives us that sense of community that people want. We want community. We're human beings. Human beings need community. But we also need to make sure that in doing that, we're not then pushing people out. We don't want people to say, oh, we're Yang Gang, and then have other people be like, oh, well, can I join? And it's like, no, it's not like an actual gang, you guys. Like, you can, like, it was a group started by, it was a movement created by a group of people, and that's awesome. It's been great. But at the same time, we don't want that community to be our downfall. We just don't, and this book literally just talks about, one of the main things we've talked about is reaching outside of the community and making coalitions, forming the coalitions with other people. Or else, like it said, isolated groups are hard pressed to achieve political goals. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen if we can't reach outside of our own echo chambers and talk to other people.
Because I've even heard people say on Twitter, I'm leaving the Yang Gang. And I'm like, that's a problem. We've gotten to the point where people are leaving, what? We have a gang, I guess, it's real. It's what? No, that was never the goal.
UBI is what brings us all together. Andrew Yang is an awesome person.
Yeah.
And we've said this before. Andrew Yang is an awesome person. But Yang Gang is, we were originally about trying to get Yang elected. The reason we wanted him elected is because we all agreed about UBI. So really, we're the UBI gang, and we're not even a gang. We're the UBI movement. We're the UBI movement, and that's something that anybody can be in if we talk about it enough. And this is important. UBI is, sorry, Mom, if you're still listening, but UBI is really fucking important. It just is. And I think regardless of political differences, regardless of any of that, UBI is important. And I think we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to our communities, we owe it to our friends and our family to reach outside of that and talk to people and form those groups. Like Kateri was saying, we'd love when the pandemic is over eventually to have local book club chapters, and not just be the book club, but also be going out and helping causes in your community, but then also reading books together. There's so many things you could be doing within your own communities to affect that change. Because when it comes down to it, UBI is going to happen, I think, in a more grassroots way than it is in this big legislative way.
Right. Definitely. Yeah. So with all that being said, we wanted to ask, I know we've been making comparisons, but we wanted to really just have the specific discussion around either if you read the book or even just hearing some of the thoughts that we had so far. How do you feel what we've learned and discussed today could actually be applied to our own specific goals, context, climate, all of these things, every situation is different.
Yeah.
I think one distinction I've made when Meghan and I have spoken in the past is yes, you could kind of frame it the way that we're trying to overthrow a dictator, but we're not. We're we just said, we're the UBI movement, humanity first movement, so yeah, we just let's put the practical implementation, any ideas for things, guidelines that we can do going forward. And maybe you don't have thoughts now, this can be a conversation that we continue on into the future. It obviously will be. That's the point. But yeah.
Let us know in the chat. I know we talked a lot, but this book, I'm just so excited about this book. I said on Twitter the other day, if you could if you could recommend 2 books to anybody and they would actually read them, what would you recommend? And this is one of the books I would recommend. I would like to get this and Crisis 2038 in the hands of everybody, like everyone. And of course, Crisis 2038, I'd say, hey, if you like the fiction version, go read the real life version. We're all normal people. But this one, I just feel like this is a really important book for our time and for people. So
yeah, I think I even agree. We should be teaching this material in schools. People should. If we're a really fully functioning democracy, our education should not just include like, this is how Congress works, this is how many people are in the Senate, and this is the role of the executive branch. Like, no, like we need to know how to work the system. Like,
what's our role? Read the people.
Yeah,
the people.
Yeah, exactly. The people branch. We need to learn about how to use the people branch in a democracy, and I think that's essentially what this is.
Yeah, it's really good. If you guys have any last thoughts or questions, the Church of UBI.
That's great. The Church of UBI.
Triggers.
That's the point. Yes, we're here for the real discussions, the real talk, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think my brain's so full right now with all of this information. So, I hope that we. Okay. Well, I'm gonna get on my soapbox for a minute while Megan's gone. Oh no, she's back. I hope that we see that, we have a little bit of work to do as far as I think Yang right now, like we exist, we're still here, but if we want to do anything, like we have to take it beyond just Twitter and trending,
Yang gang.
and beyond the Yang gang. Yeah, something to consider. It's hard because you kind of need a leader, and it doesn't feel like, I don't know, it doesn't feel as much like Andrew Yang is necessarily our leader. Like, he's still a very, very important person. And I think we can do a lot by simply following his lead. But yeah, it's definitely, I think there are things that we could do more. And so, Megan and I have thoughts, and come 2021 or sometime around then, make sure you're checking back in. Yeah, maybe reading can save lives.
Yeah. Education is important. Education is knowledge, and knowledge is power.
So yeah. Great.
Awesome. So someone asked what the next book is, and I actually have it.
Megan has it. I'll let Megan hold it up.
It's The Future Earth.
And guess what, guys? This book talks about UBI too. We didn't even intend that.
It's an accident, but anyways, it's really pretty. It's also big font.
Yeah. So this is the shortest book that we have. It's like,
yeah.
Very long.
It's really pretty.
It's got big font too.
He lives in Minnesota. Sorry, Minnesota. So yeah, it's very pretty. It's kind of short. But we want to make sure that we're kind of covering a lot of different topics. And the fact that this also mentions UBI, like Terry said, is a total accident.
Yeah, we didn't intend that. So essentially, this book, we picked this book. We called it, as we like to say, "That's So Yang Gang," because yes, it's climate change wasn't a huge cornerstone of Andrew Yang's campaign, but positivity, hopefulness, the idea of we can create a better world for ourselves, and that's what this book is, as a climate change book. Is it does have the good first section of it is not so positive, but then it really gets into the bulk of it is getting into what our world could really look like if we actually successfully did what we needed to do to stop and reverse climate change. It is really realistic. And even in the end, there's actually like a whole section on like things. Oh, I am terrible at showing pages on here. Things you can do. Like, I don't know if you can tell, but yeah, there's like, it's got a practical implementation in the back. So we're definitely we're like spoon feeding you all the information with these.
Yes.
Making it really easy, guys. So yeah, great, short, hopeful read on climate change. So I'm really
a little
excited
change of pace.
And who knows, maybe we'll also have some more exciting conversations with some exciting people.
Hint, hint.
On this one in the future.
This is important, by the way. If you guys can, use your local library apps for these. Try to look at it now, because sometimes there are holds. Audiobooks are always a good option. That is a form of reading, just so people know. But yeah, supporting your local libraries is a great thing to do. Also, I did want to address Steve, who is in the chat, Stephen, who's in the chat with us. He has a book that Kateri and I will be reading on the side, and we will let you guys know about it. He is also a big UBI warrior since I think he said like the 80s and 90s, since like the 90s.
Yeah.
You know, so a lot to learn from with him, and hopefully, you know, we might have a YGBC talks with him someday. So
yeah, that is the goal. So yeah, so we're gonna keep thinking about all of these things. And thank you all. You know, we knew this was gonna be a big one because there's just so much information to go through. So if you've been here the whole time, thank you. If you're just checking in, this will be up, you know, that you can watch it more podcast style maybe in the future. So yeah, so this was our July book. This is our August book. We've got some fun things planned for August already, so stay tuned. Watch this space.
I will say next weekend, you guys, we have a very special, exciting guest. So make sure you turn on notifications on Twitter for the announcement.
I guess I'll shout out two things before we go.
Mm-hmm.
Reader friend group chat, guys. I know like Nell is in it. Manny, I don't know if you're in it. You should be in it. Daniel's in it. Okay, so not everyone has notifications, I think, and you know, we thought it would be good to have a group chat for those of you who are really active and don't want to miss things. So we throw in announcements, we throw in, you know, we remind you about, you know, Takeover Tuesday is happening today. Here's who it is. Here's the Wednesdays we write prompt. Here's the Think Harder Thursday. So you don't miss it, and it's not necessarily like you're getting a ton of notifications for us.
But also
it's crucial stuff.
Yeah, but also Bella message us so we remember. Also, though, if you guys have any ideas or like brainstorms or you want to talk about it, like you can put that in the chat as well. Like it's not just like here's a reminder, here's a reminder, here's a reminder. It's also like if you guys have an idea, hey, have you guys talked about this? Let us know, you know, or if you have ideas for, you know, eventually we want to have like merch or like a website. If you guys have any knowledge or ideas about that, that's what that chat is for too, you know. So it's very exciting.
So if you get this book, this will maybe be our last announcement. If you get this book, we're trying to discuss the book throughout the month. So Meghin and I, this is an Uprising post. You might have noticed we posted some like hashtag Sunday reads where we like had a quote and, you know, discussed it a little bit, encouraged discussion in the comments. So you could you could just do a tweet and we'll retweet you, but we're trying to encourage people to send us videos. So if you're interested, you can DM us directly, or you can let us know. We'll put you in the Reader Friends group chat. That, you know, you're like, hey, like they said this one thing and like I really like that quote and I really want to talk about it, and you don't have to wait until the end of the month. And also be in the comment section, like you can talk about it to the community, and you know, we can have discussions So either do that or look out for the videos and, you know, just help support us by having conversation with us.
Mm-hmm.
Either one is great.
Yeah.
So look out for that Sunday reads.
Yes, Sarah actually did Takeover Tuesday. They're booked out for a little while, but I'm always looking forward to schedule them, and you can send them in at any time. So if you're interested in doing a takeover, like Sarah, send us a DM, and I'll get you scheduled in and let you guys know everything we do with that. Same. Twitter moves fast. Yes, Twitter moves fast, so we definitely understand this. And then Nell, so helpful as always. Tell us in the chat, Nell. So yeah, I think just like stay tuned because, like I said, we have a pretty exciting out of the box live stream next weekend. I'm pretty excited about it. So you guys make sure you are looking out for that.
Yeah. We like that the Yang Gang Book Club has opportunities to grow the Yang Gang by making it easier to have conversations around whatever, not just UBI stuff, with anyone. So you never know when you might get a surprise guest on this channel.
Hint, hint, hint. You guys would never guess.
It's a little random, but it's cool. Okay, we'll stop teasing you. Okay, thanks for being here, guys. As always, you are awesome reader friends. Yang Gang Book Club out, I guess. Everyone say bye.
Yeah. Bye, guys.
Bye. Love you. Bye.